But here's a January topic analysis from Equality and Forensics. So that being said, so I'm Ava. I'm a PF debater on the Dreyfoos team, and I'm a sophomore.
Yeah, and I'm Josh. I'm a coach at Ivy Bridge Academy. I have about 4 years. I did 4 years of like high school LD. Currently a college policy debater at Georgia State. I've been doing that for a few years. I coach PF though in pretty much for middle school, high school. We send students to a couple of national tournaments like the TOC digital stuff. So if you've seen our name around before, that's kind of cool. If not, then I hope that we'll beat you sometime in the future. But at least for now, yeah, that's where we're at.
Okay. So just a quick lesson overview. We're going to be going over in this order the key terms in the topic breakdown, some court cases and background so you understand why we're debating this topic, and then pro arguments and con arguments. And then at the end, there's some overall topic stems that we don't really dive into, but that you really have like the opportunity to build off of from your cases.
And something from this is that we want everybody to understand that this is meant to build key concepts with a foundation for your topic knowledge going forward. You still have to do prep, and you still need to understand more so the historical background and broad pictures of what the good arguments are going to be. But also, like this is going to help ideally give a good foundation of where you can build arguments from. At least the research that through me and Ava have done, we're trying to make sure that if you're reading about the topic and if you're going into future arguments, you are able to understand the basis of where you're going, especially jumping into a new topic with new terms and new ideas. It's always hard. We understand that. And that's what this is meant to be. And because this is a narrow topic, which because like some topics have lots and lots of possible arguments, this topic, meanwhile, there's probably at most like 7 or 8 good arguments on each side. And even then, that's probably like me being a little bit generous to the topic. That means that there's not a lot of arguments you need to know. You can focus a lot more on having very concentrated, in-depth analysis on a very few arguments, which is what we're doing here. We're only focusing on 4 arguments each side today, and then doing a little bit more just like broad coverage at the end. But we're trying to make sure that you guys can leave this with a more in-depth idea of a few arguments. And this isn't going to be in the form of cards. This is going to be in the form of just a genuine conversation that you understand the arguments rather than just getting handed a packet. So you can go to the next slide.
Okay, so just starting on the topic breakdown. So first, the resolution resolved, the United States federal government should repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. The actor is the United States federal government. The action is repealing Section 230, and then obviously Section 230 is the object. And in the next couple slides, we're going to get into this a little bit more.
So to start off, a healthy little reminder that the actor is the United States federal government. There are 3 parts of the government: the federal, state, and local levels. Your federal obviously is going to be your national government, where it covers all precincts. There's going to be the state, which is going to be like your Georgia, North Carolina, and then local, which will be your states, cities, not states, your cities and counties. And the federal government specifically, that when we look at it, consists of 3 branches: the legislative branch, which we say is a bicameral legislator, which includes both the House and Senate, total of 535 between the two; the judicial branch, which is going to include all courts, which is important to note because a lot of times people will talk about the Supreme Court of the United States, which there are appeals in other courts that exist. And then there's the executive branch, which includes the president and the veto power, all that, which will be important as we're going to talk about the ways in which you can repeal an action for you having the actual ideas of like what a repeal would look like. If we go to the next slide. So the topic is really interesting because the word repeal is super, super broad. Like, what does it usually mean? Or like, and there's like a specific way in which people always repeal actions. I'm going to talk about all the different ways in which repeals work. Because it's something that when we look at it, the first thought is, oh, it just means like we get rid of an action. And it's important to realize that there's multiple ways that it can be repealed, because in many ways, Section 230 has been repealed multiple times over in different ways. And so first, the legal definition of repeal that we're going to be using for today is that it's the rescission of an existing law by subsequent legislation or constitutional amendment. You could use any definition. All of them are going to come to roughly same conclusions, but that's the easiest way to look at it. It is overriding a law through a future law of some sort. It has to be passed through Congress. And in that, there's two different types of repeals. And I use different terms for each of them. There's explicit/express repeals, which are explicit and express would be the same, and then implicit and implied are the same. But the main idea is that if something is explicitly repealed, there's a meant to only get rid of, or not only get rid of, but it will say in direct terms that the original law is going away. So there would be an actual action that says Section 230 is going away. Meanwhile, implicit/implied repeals would be that it is not actually being told it's going away, but there's a new law that overrides the previous one. So for example, if there was a new law that was created that didn't say it was getting rid of Section 230, but actually was just being a new law that overrode the previous law because it is a newer one and thus would like basically postdate the law. And so additionally, it's important to note that saving and that repeals can be done in two other ways, with or without savings. So this is the terminology that is often used in legislative bodies for how these are used across even more than the United States. If it is done with savings, that means that there is some parts of the initial law that are kept. And if it's without savings, that means there are some parts that like there's no parts of the law that are kept. So if we completely get rid of Section 230, including parts A through D, which includes like policy stances, it includes how it interacts with other laws. Those are various parts that are also part of Section 230 that we don't directly think of, but it would be going away Section 232. That would mean that the repeal is without savings. Meanwhile, if we only were to repeal Part C of Section 230, only Part C1 or Part C2, or maybe Part B, like there's so many parts to Section 230, it's a little bit diverse. But more likely than not, we could assume that the broad general idea of the topic would imply an express repeal without savings, because that would be a totalizing idea of it. In the same way that we look at a topic of a ban, we'd never assume a moratorium because the word ban is explicitly chosen for a reason. In the way that we should follow the topic wording in a broad sense of it, especially as we saw last year with the India topic, how the word ratify was changed to sign to be very direct with the way that the general idea of topics are meant to be. So normal means, once again, would be an express repeal without savings. So it's a full repeal of a new law that directly overturns the legislation. There's not a new legislation that we can assume that comes in from it.
Okay, so here's the actual Section 230, like the act itself. So it has two parts, but the first part is A, that Section 230 states that no provider shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another provider. And in simpler terms, no provider or social media platform can be held liable for third-party content posted on their site. So let's just like do like a real life example, right? So what it's basically saying is that Facebook, like the company, cannot be held liable and has no responsibility for anything that we would post on their platform. Meaning that if we were to post any like hate speech or anything that's illegal, they can't get sued over it. Like they don't have like liability for any of that. The second part is like Section 230C, and it says no provider or user shall be held liable on account of any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access to material that the provider or user considers to be obscene. So basically what it's saying is that Section 230 gives complete and total legal immunity to sites that choose not to police their content. So it's up to the third party themselves to decide what kind of restrictions they want to impose on their own platform. And this like poses problems like later down the line, which we'll get to more when we go to certain like pro arguments and neg arguments. But yeah, that's the basis of Section 230. And I highly recommend going in and reading all the parts and like especially the fine prints, because that's going to be pretty important. Okay, so let's just talk about why 230 was enacted in the first place, so you can kind of get a gist of why we're like even here debating this in the first place. So Section 230 was enacted 25 years ago, and I think that's going to be a really big part of this topic, not the 25 years ago part, but meaning that we don't face the same issues that we faced 25 years ago when the internet was like a little baby. Like there's a lot more challenges that come up along the way, and that's why we need to focus on like this resolution as a whole. So Section 230 was created like at the start to help aid internet startup companies and incentivize them to stop censoring speech, right? Because without Section 230, it makes it a lot harder for companies to like start up on the internet because they're constantly getting sued for anything they do if they're not like really strictly policing their content, which comes to the idea of like censoring speech. Right. However, new concerns have come up as the internet has progressed because we're seeing more stuff online that can be problematic and its implications go even further than they did in the beginning. So that's why this was enacted, and that's why we're debating it today, just for reference. Okay, there are two main court cases we're going to talk about today. You might not need them when you debate, but I think it's just good to know why like the resolution was being brought up, and these are pretty recent court cases. So I would suggest just reading into them just so you have like that prior knowledge. It's always to like try and like outlearn all the information so you know more than your opponents. But okay, so the first case is Gonzalez versus Google, and it's the Gonzalez family sued Google, alleging that YouTube's role in the death during the 2015 Paris attacks. So basically what happened is someone was killed like during like the Paris attacks, and they're blaming YouTube because like like, okay, so like online what's been happening is like, you know how like people like drive and like fuel different like protests and like all of these things. So this was like fueled on YouTube and then someone died, so the family was trying to sue, saying that Google would be liable because like their algorithm like keeps bringing up these attacks, but it was overruled because under section 230, again, these third parties don't have liability for what happens. So that was like one of the court cases. um and yeah, this was like seen as like a big win for free speech, because like section 230 is like immunity held up for third party platforms, so they aren't like forced to censor speech. And then the other case that's kind of similar is the Twitter case. And it's the same kind of situation, but it was an Islamic State attack in Istanbul. And the family sued Twitter, Google, and Facebook, alleging that all of them failed to control terrorist content, because these companies are like profit driven essentially. So they post like in the algorithm whatever gets them more views. And most of the time, like content that has more interaction can be problematic, which is what happened in this case, which is why like they sued, because they alleged like they had part in like fueling like the motive for this attack. And but section 230 like prevailed. And yeah. Okay, but now let's just go into like the overview of the possible arguments. So on the pro, there's A, misinformation, hate speech, trafficking, and terrorism. And on the con, there's free speech, court clog, decentralization, and reform. And these are just like the 8 arguments that we chose to go more in depth on today. Obviously, there's more arguments out there, but again, as Joshua was saying, the scope of this topic is like pretty narrow, but there's definitely more arguments you can build upon, and we'll talk about that more later. Okay, pro arguments. Okay, so the first pro argument we wrote down is misinformation. So due to protections provided by Section 230, online platforms have less incentive to monitor and patrol what's posted on their platforms, because again, they're not liable for anything that happens on their platform. So there's no reason for them to go in and like cut down on and like increase content restrictions, because they're not liable. They're not getting sued. It has no impact on them. So this has led to misinformation being rampant online, which is bad because most Americans have and do interact with social media daily, and a lot of us can even get our news from social media, which can be problematic when there's misinformation online. So the possible impacts of this can be a political violence, because think about it logically. Misinformation splits parties into their extremist forms, because you have information coming from like very biased news sources just trying to like fuel your political opinions, and that's what the algorithm does. It gives you what you want to see, so that's where the misinformation comes in. So right, this leads to more extremism, because people are being like fed all this misinformation that like sides with them, so then they start to believe it and they get mad, which only adds fuel to the fire. And this is bad because extremism leads to political violence, which undermines democracy as a whole, and even like the most strong cases in the U.S. and like cases in Europe. And like a couple examples, like we can just think about, like the one example that comes to mind is like the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol, right? We had like a lot of extremism from the right wing Republicans, and then they like storm the Capitol. So it can lead to political violence, and there are like so many more instances if you just do a little bit of research. And the second impact is kind of similar. It's the youth radicalization impact. So its algorithms are targeting younger generations because they're the ones who are predominantly online compared to those who are like a lot older. And this leads them down like a slippery slope of misinformation, and leads to political violence among youth, which is bad because like they're the next generation of us, right? So like if they're like have more extremist views and they're like more polarized, then that's going to be shown in the future. So like that's like the entire idea, but both impacts just tie back into political violence. The second argument, it is hate speech. So again, like because of Section 230, companies aren't incentivized to censor content that might cause harm or contain hateful speech. And as like hate speech arises during geopolitical tensions right now, because there's so many conflicts going on, it's really important that like moderation, because we need peace. But when you repeal Section 230, companies don't want to get sued. What happens is, since they don't have like the protection under Section 230, they can get sued over like a lot of different content on their platform. So they're going to crack down on filtering out hateful and like violent content. So we're not going to be seeing like the same hate speech we see online today, because I'm like pretty sure like we've all seen it on social media. It's very prevalent. So the possible impacts of this are A, targeted violence. Violent and like hate speech fuel aggression, especially towards like certain minority groups, leading to genocide and targeted violence. Like one example was like the genocide in Myanmar against like a certain group of Muslims. And there are like there have been many more examples throughout history, like so many different examples. But the entire idea is that like when you repeal Section 230, then this is not going to happen as often because we're going to have these companies cracking down and trying to limit this. The second impact is mental health, because when people are targeted online, they can experience like psychological and emotional upheavals from all this like hate coming towards them and like their like certain groups, which is really bad because you don't want anyone to be like depressed, and also can like lead to suicide and stuff. So that's the hate speech argument. It like has the same like uniqueness as the misinformation argument.
Okay, okay. So no, I'm going to talk about trafficking. This is possibly my favorite argument in this topic because I think there's no way to really beat it super well. There's like the amount of actual answers to it. From what I've seen, while things like hate speech and misinformation, there's a lot of answers can be on the level of like quality social media, type of social media. Trafficking is one where the main arguments you can make normally to these types of arguments aren't going to work. Mostly because one, I'm going to talk about a lot of historical examples about how partial not work on trafficking, but as well as like having this historical background in this contention will give you the ability to beat all the common blocks. People are going to make arguments like social media or the internet doesn't increase trafficking, but that's not going to be a persuasive argument. There's no great way to prove that the internet doesn't increase trafficking, as we've seen trafficking increase so much in recent years. It's one of those few arguments in debates that are just like, this is kind of just true. And so the first example I'm going to give of a repeal failing, or at least people trying to do a partial repeal onto Section 230, but the partial repeal not being enough is the FOSTA-SESTA Act. The FOSTA-SESTA Act was originally two different bills. It was one from the House and one from the Senate, but they got coupled together. The short terminology for it, if you want to look it up online, it's called the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. And essentially, it explicitly said that you cannot use 230 to protect yourself if you facilitate the issue at hand. However, even though the bill calls directly out 230 and says that it is a change to it, it makes it express and retains the vast majority of the original 230, but the way in which it changes the form of power, it actually almost made like the ability to sex traffic easier because it added an extra addendum that these companies need to have facilitated it, which also in some ways changes previous acts on how sex traffickers are dealt with in here. So actually made that FOSTA-SESTA, which was meant to make sex trafficking harder, actually almost made it easier because of how it redefined it in the eyes of social media. So there's a few different court cases that have been seen on Section 230 that have been super, super influential, but have actually made it a little bit possibly easier and have ruled that Section 230 both makes it good, but makes like finding companies like liable for trafficking really hard, and even means that the FOSTA-SESTA Act has failed. So the first court case I'm going to talk about is before FOSTA-SESTA. It was the Fair Housing Council of San Fernando Valley versus Roommates.com Act, Supreme Court case, not Supreme Court case. It was the United States Court of Appeals to the Ninth Circuit. It ruled on whether or not Roommates.com was a passive entity. The court ruled that to the extent that Roommates.com required users to provide information that violated the Fair Housing Act, it would be held liable for that specific information. This decision established that while Section 230 provides a broad immunity to online platforms for third-party content, platforms that actively encourage, solicit, or develop content that violates federal law may not be shielded from liability. So basically, if you require and utilize information, that can help people target. And because of that, if the targeting is utilized, then that is not something 230 can provide immunity from. However, we can see how this decision is not enough to be a precedent already for the court case. This also frames the legal lens of the court. Section 230 is not a law of what you aren't allowed to do. It is a law of immunity, where as long as you fit certain parameters, you cannot be held liable for this. And this is like part of the way that FOSTA-SESTA makes sex trafficking partially easier, because it rules how the ways in which Section 230 is almost something where you opt into by meeting certain norms. And once you do that, you meet the idea of immunity, and then you're able to get away with lots of stuff as long as you meet the basic criteria of allowing free act. And we see that it does apply that when you are able to filter certain content that makes it where it's no longer the free speech in which it normally can be seen, because the ability to filter content using forced filters that so if I apply to a website or if I make an account on a website and it forces me to give certain demographics and it uses demographics to sort me, then it doesn't allow Section 230 to apply to that company. So it's interesting because it changes the ways in which Section 230 is applied. The next court case is Jane Doe's v. Reddit. It's about child porn being facilitated on Reddit, and Reddit got the case dismissed completely. This actually found that FOSTA's partial repeal made trafficking worse, as it includes edits to 230, that the standard for beneficiary liability is higher To be held criminally liable as a beneficiary, a defendant must have actual knowledge of the trafficking and must assist, support, or facilitate the trafficking. This meant that allowing the trafficking to exist unmoderated is functionally okay as long as you turn a blind eye, which is crazy that these court cases are being found, and that like we can see like very clear evidence of things like child porn on Reddit, and Reddit's not held liable at all. It has no need to moderate it because it's allowed to turn a blind eye. So this shows that 230 is not enough right now. 230 is unable to hold companies accountable when there are things like child videos that are inappropriate, or anything's being spread around that would be normally seen as like unacceptable in any way because of the ways they can destroy lives. And even then, social media definitely increases trafficking. We see lots of evidence for this, and this is a very popular part that we're going to see across the topic literature. It creates places where people can talk in anonymity over long distances, and if nothing else, it gives the ability to create unmoderated echo chambers. That means people can find others with similarly horrible beliefs or ideas. And if all that wasn't bad enough, people can profit off of trafficking. There's lots of adult video sites that rely on trafficking for a very large amount of the videos that exist on their platforms. That gives financial incentives to traffic in many ways, where either it's showing videos of kids or kidnapping people to utilize them for these different modes of profiting, which I don't think I should have to like explain a lot of like the specific terms of that, because that's like kind of weird for me to talk about right now. But the idea that people can profit off of various people being exploited, which is not good. And the impacts of this, there's three that I highlighted real quick. The first is that structural violence, that trafficking disproportionately hurts minorities and poor communities through trafficking. There's a lot less resources to find people that are taken, both privately and through things like police, where in areas that have higher crime rates or that overall are poorer, there's less police and higher crime rates, which would lead to less resources to find kids or even adults that are kidnapped and trafficked. That would mean that this would disproportionately hurt these communities insofar as that trafficking is occurring in larger numbers. Additionally, trauma is an independent impact in and of itself. If tens of thousands of people are being directly affected by trafficking a year, and if you can prove that social media is able to add to that, that means that there is a very easy like argument that would outweigh on some sort of moral obligation, where trauma is inherently bad. We can isolate it's bad. If you're winning a very strong link into it, then you can utilize things like probability first in order to take these arguments out. Additionally, trafficking even has some like big impacts to you, such as governmental trust. In ways you can see stability as a internal link and impact of government trust, where trafficking actively causes instability as it causes widespread paranoia and isolationism, meaning you can link to stuff like hegemony and legitimacy of the government, where how people follow laws, how people are able to uphold their own social relations, how this can cause possibly you can even argue things like a broad terrorism impact as an outcome of trafficking, even though I don't know how persuasive that could be. This argument relies on a very strong probability push, as the linked arguments here are going to be unbelievably strong. There's so much literature on this, and most of the literature would point to social media and Section 230 being worse for things like trafficking, especially with the lack of moderation. Especially, I don't think I'm allowed to say the name here just because it's like, it is, I think, rated, it's mature on Netflix. There's a really good Netflix documentary on the war of specifically how adult video companies are facilitating trafficking, which I'll not name as I'm don't 100% sure of the rating, but it's a really good documentary for especially any debaters that are 18. And so that's not good. There's definitely sites that show adult videos that are going to be facilitated and monetized, which we can overcome with Section 230, which would prove that a repeal would probably be good there. The next contention is terrorism that I'll go over. So on terrorism, for the most part, it's so strong because this is one of the strongest impacts that we see in debate normally. It's one of the few impacts that has a really good way of linking to extinction. And this time, we actually have a really strong link to it for once. I feel like most topics that have a terrorism impact aren't really good at getting the link to terrorism to be very strong. It'll be something vague. Meanwhile, we can see the echo chambers that are created as a result of social media, able to really facilitate terrorism in rather unique ways that don't exist without Section 230. So the first part of this I want to talk about is that terrorism in itself as an impact is unbelievably valuable. It's something that is unique in debate because it has an emotional resonance with people that live in these communities. And that's something that overrides traditional checks of rationality, which we see in things like arguments about like nuclear weapons, where people will talk about rational actors check, and this does not check in terrorism. So if you were trying to go on a route of a big impact, terrorism is super good because you can talk about the ways in which it's not about the actual outcomes of these acts, it's about the ideas that stem from them that affect people in the same way that, like, for example, like a business confidence argument would work, where you're not looking at the actual economy, you look at the confidence people have within these areas. And things like terrorism, even in small amounts, cause massive political instability, as we see how people worry about this happening. I mean, 9/11 is an amazing example of this, where even though 9/11, like on the grand scheme of things, like compared to things like wars, a relatively small amount of people died, but the impact it had broadly on society from it changed the political landscape for, I mean, possibly forever. So that makes the contention really like stand out a lot in its value. So now I want to talk about the actual link argument here, because social media algorithms, especially with 230, push things like extremist content. This was mentioned earlier by Ava, which is fantastic. And I think that this is amazing for terrorism arguments too, because social media algorithms are notorious for amplifying extremist content, as things that are more extreme are more likely to get more views, more clicks, thus be pushed more by algorithms. And this is beyond even just social media. This is on all news networks in the way that even if they allow people to post without heavy moderation, this then means that people can push this content and not be held liable for it. So examples, additionally, like, there's lots of examples of prominent content reaching broader audiences because of this. There was like the defamation case that, for example, Fox News had to deal with, where they were talking, like, where they spread misinformation about voting, and we see that is like an example of like people being held liable. But normally, you're not able to be held liable for things that people say on your network unless like you are directly facilitating it. Which means that things like Twitter or Facebook, when they have this type of content going around, it's really, really hard in order to catch and take out this violence. So one example of this is Twitter, which enables hyper-conservative rhetoric a lot in its content. We see how Elon Musk is a reply guy, replying on a lot of people's messages, and specifically putting and like getting rid of, like, well, putting forward conservative rhetoric and getting rid of rhetoric on that would be considered like more liberal. And these algorithmic processes escalate the spread of problematic rhetoric, which can cause higher risks of terrorism. A lot of terrorist attacks that we can see in in recent years, including things like school shootings, realistically any, like most terrorist attacks, you can see histories of these people being active on social media, spreading hate rhetoric, or being inside of communities that were spreading hate rhetoric, and they were victims of people that learned it, which is just such a good example. There's very few arguments, like this is such a strong link argument that you gain from this. And additionally, Section 230, because of its rhetoric and the spirit it has around free speech. So if you look at Section 230, there are a few different parts to it. There is the one that we highlighted earlier was 230C, which is the actual policy implication that people can look at for how to evaluate Section 230, but there's also a Section 230B, which is about the policy stances the United States has going forward around the idea of free speech to begin with and the internet. And the spirit of those arguments of 230 advocate not for helpful speech, but for free speech broadly without these barriers. And we see this, the rhetoric that this has being applied very directly now, where people think that they have the ability to say things, therefore they say them, even if it's not a like productive thing to say. So this creates like a very big dichotomy between free speech and helpful speech, or like valuable speech. And so we have to look at the ways that 230 allows anybody to think that just because they can speak, they will, which spreads more harmful rhetoric in this way. And repealing Section 230 forces platforms to scrutinize content that normally it might be seen as, I mean, I don't know, like I was going to say definitely a word that should not be said as like an example of it, but people posting a lot that would be harmful or hateful towards specific groups or about attacking individual groups. And instead they have to look at, like, they have to actually take that knowledge down, which is good for helping solve terrorism. This is really important, as you could link this to terrorism in many ways. Like we see direct impacts, direct links to terrorist attacks, but the direct deaths from terrorist attacks is something that is very unique on this topic, as there's not a lot of arguments on this topic that have direct deaths as an impact. We can see things like social violence, but we're not going to be seeing a lot of arguments that affect direct human, which terrorism has a unique ability to access, and the instabilities and impact, which can lead to governmental failure, is also going to give like unique ways of getting into things like wars, which is on this topic, is not something that we should normally be looking at, because it's a lot about the spirit of the ways in which people interact with each other, the interpersonal relationships, but instead we get access to an instability argument. And we can see this being really big because of the lack of trust in governments, because the breakdown in societal trust and order, which means that the terrorism contention is overall going to be really good because it reaches beyond the common debate impacts that we're going to be seeing on this topic. It helps us address the need to prioritize the valuable speech over unrestricted speech. It allows us to see why 230 specifically creates the ability for lots of terrorism, which is something that's going to be unique to 230. And if nothing else, it is a really good, like, just base way to have a strong outweighing impact if you're really good at impact calculus. So if you think that your best debates are going to be on impact calc, this gives you the strong link to do impact calc on. So that's why I think it's a really good contention for the pro.
Okay, so now on to card arguments. Okay, so the first argument is pretty common. It's the free speech argument. So basically, it says that because repeal of Section 230 allows companies to be held liable for the content posted, that means they're going to increase the amount of moderation they see, like through their platform. So they're probably going to like introduce different like artificial technology that will like try and like sort and like basically police sites to make sure there's less like content that could be like could get them sued. So anything that might be just a little bit controversial or a little bit like include hate speech, anything's going to be filtered out, which is going to lead to increased censorship, which people say like might harm free speech. So the impact that we talk about here is political activism. So censorship makes it harder for social media campaigns to get heard and gain momentum because if we're cracking down on moderation, it means that they are most likely going to be like moderated even more too. So it's going to be a lot harder for them to like get their message out when a lot of these like activism groups use social media as like their main platform to try and like spread information. So in the status quo, especially with like the Israel-Palestine conflict, and then we just had the Russia-Ukraine conflict, activism is like extremely prevalent everywhere we look, and it could have an eventual impact if like it keeps going. But when you repeal Section 230, this activism goes away because there's no chance for it to even happen if companies are cracking down and like not even allowing it to happen in the first place by like practically like deleting it. So we might never see any of this like activism or action that like could take place later on. But like whereas we might see that in the neg world if we continue with Section 230. Does that like make sense to everyone? But yeah, so that's like the free speech argument. But I also think there are like a couple different impacts you could use on this. Like one impact that like people might use is like the whole like First Amendment thing. But I was talking about like to Joshua about this earlier, and like we don't really think it's like that strong because yeah, the Constitution like it's there, but like it can be violated. Like I feel like an impact that's more like that will actually like harm people, like either like physically or we're not going to see like the activism we're going to see would be like a lot stronger. But the good thing about like the free speech argument is I feel like it's very pliable and you can definitely like do like a different impact route. And I think it's like pretty true. Okay, the next argument is court clog. And I feel like very recently court clog has become more prevalent in PF. Like it was big last topic. It might be big this topic. We don't know yet. There's only been one tournament, but I think it probably will be. But the entire premise behind this argument is that Section 230 prevents companies from being legally responsible. Thus, many companies, when faced with lawsuits about their moderation or lack thereof, use Section 230 as a defense. So this prevents them from being sued, meaning there's going to be less court cases throughout like all the different circuits. So when you repeal Section 230, companies are going to get sued because eventually something is going to slip through the cracks. Like there is some information that is going to be controversial, and that's why they're going to get sued. And that happens when you don't have 230. But this leads to a lot of court cases, which can like literally clog the courts. So this prevents, or at least speeds up the litigation period, preventing U.S. judicial systems from being backed up. And when they're backed up, like it weakens the U.S. government and slows down governmental functions in like a couple of ways. But like let's just look at like some of the impact scenarios we talked about. So one of like the more stock impacts that pertains to justice is that like if the courts are backed up, retribution and those getting what they deserve is slowed down, which can cause death, poverty, and all sorts of things you have to sue to solve. Like so, right? So a lot of like there are like a lot more important impacts and like what's going to happen like with like the whole Section 230 court cases. But those court cases, there's going to be so many of them that it's going to prevent us from getting the more important cases that like as they extend on and like slow down, we're going to see like more death and poverty because we're not seeing the solvency that we would be seeing like in the status quo, and it's going to be taking a lot longer, which is pretty bad. Another one like could be any extinction scenario. You can pretty much link like anything to extinction in PF, but the one like thing here is like climate change solvency, right? So like the judicial system is like really important for climate change solvency, and like we need it because like if we want to have more different like climate policies like moving forward, like we need the court to help with that. And same with like anything for like foreign invasions and like like democratic decay. So like we all need like the judicial system for that. But when you like affirm the resolution and like you have all this like influx of court cases, then it takes a lot longer to get to any of these scenarios, which can be pretty detrimental considering that like climate change is like increasing really fast and geopolitical tensions are also increasing really really fast. So it's important that like as a government we can like get to these things like quickly and efficiently. But when you affirm, you can like prevent that like through the court clog argument because you're slowing down the courts. And yeah, like the diet impact, like everything can lead to death if you make it.
Okay. So next, I'm going to take the decentralization argument. So this is one of at least going through the con stuff, this is my favorite because this argument is one that's more one on the internal link debate. So what I mean by that is a lot of the arguments on this topic are going to be won by winning a core link and then like whatever your terminal impact is. Meanwhile, this argument is going to have a pretty much like not uncontested core link argument in that 230 will cause decentralization. 230 causes centralization of social media. And the idea here is that you are going to be winning that. And people will likely try to turn the decentralization argument, but they're not going to contest the 2030 cause centralization. Because when you look at a lot of the pro arguments, a lot of them almost can rely on centralization being good or bad in some way. And so you want to just directly contest that specific argument. So I'm going to talk about why decentralization is going to be uniquely good in this scenario for this. So on this, the idea that like it relies on the fact that one of the core ways in which media sites are going to have to work is that they're going to have to regulate more and more. And this can happen in a few ways. One that I'm going to talk more about later, but at least right now, is that some companies probably will either go to shutting down lots of the ways in which people post, adding more regulations how people post, or not even allowing certain speech in general, possibly even causing prior moderation, where your posts will have to be moderated before it's even on the site to avoid legislation as much as possible. This makes it where people will feel some sort of de facto segregation because they will want to be in places that agree with them, and a place that might have moderation, that might oppose them, they'll think to go there. We already see that there's lots of different sites that exist that's where people go to just because it is a site that has like a higher political agreement with them. And this is a core way that a lot of echo chambers work from people. So we could argue that centralization, like if decentralization happens, people go to more independent social media sites. They will go to places that agree with them specifically. And this is something that you can like link a lot to how humans move right now, where we see people like going either to or from areas to have more political rhetoric towards them. And on social media, we see this even more, but there is like explicit social media, like explicit like alt-right sites. There's like explicit leftist sites, and because of that, people will go where they think they are accepted. Because if somebody is moderated and their speech is called hate speech, even if they don't think it is, it'll be seen as an attack on that person's beliefs. And so they'll go to places where they feel more accepted, such as if somebody doesn't feel part of the church, they will go to a church that agrees with them instead of trying to understand the ideas of the first place. Or if you're in a political group, so if I'm at a rally for any party and I don't feel welcome there because it's something that I don't think my speech is heard, I will go to a different political rally where I feel heard. Not saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm saying that's what most people end up doing. That's why when people go to these individual groups, that cause more echo chambers, very similar to the modern party structure, where people are made to go to areas where they think that is where they are voiced, which can cause one, like you can make an argument here that even like this reinforces like two parties, this increases polarization. But more even like beyond that, this is a very strategic argument, as you can talk about the ways in which people are functionally forced to have to pull into echo chambers because they have to go to social media sites that agree with them because they just don't feel welcome on sites that now have to increase regulation and thus get rid of stuff that the social media site might disagree with. So we see this even right now with this. In the status quo, there's a lack of moderation and an increase of algorithms, which is not great. We are not trying to argue that in any way that the status quo is somehow amazing at getting rid of extremism. But the argument you make here is that it actually increases from people going to more concentrated sites. We already see large amounts of terrorism or trafficking, as I mentioned before. There's already large amounts of hate speech, but whether or not there is large amounts of that could increase possibly because of the ways in which people could be forced to individual sites. If you only ever listen to like PragerU for your political knowledge, you're probably just racist. But also, if you're doing that, then that is something where you are forced in an echo chamber. And if you're only people that you know talk about that, then like there is an echo chamber that's created, which is not good if people are there. Regardless, no matter what political belief you have, there's probably some idea that you have to look at multiple sources in order to not be like into one opinion explicitly. And so decentralization is bad because centralization is not as bad for echo chambers. This is an argument where you're talking about the better of two bad worlds. Thank you, Lucas. So, I think I shouldn't have read that, lost my place. Oh yeah, so centralization additionally creates visibility of hate speech. When people are able to have hate speech, but it's more in public, that makes it where even obviously if it's bad because it hurts people, it makes it where it's not festering up and bubbling and creating more and more of the same hate speech is able to be called out. If there is a debater that posts in like a public Discord that all of a sudden like, oh, this one debater is like really bad, or like this person did whatever, like it creates visibility to that. Meanwhile, if it's done privately or done away from the public, then it's done, like people don't point it out. We see this like if you look on 4chan and the crazy threads that exist there where people will just go down spirals and spirals of just not understanding the world and having no way to call them out because nobody that disagrees with them will be on this servers. And so that makes it where centralization at least creates visibility, which is better than the alternative. And so this creates functionally a de facto segregation in social media if we repeal it, because it means that people, even though they're not going to be actually forced to go one place or the other, they're functionally made to go because they feel like they have to. So then decentralization is, I think, at least a pretty cool argument. Do you want to go to the next one? Perfect. And the next argument we're going to talk about is reform. So this is one that is also going to be really strategic because it functions like a PIC does in policy or LD, if anybody's familiar with that. So what I mean by functions like a PIC is like a short term for plan inclusive counterplan, aka it's going to be the F minus a few parts, and that minus a few parts is going to be the net benefit. That's going to be what you gain access to there. So you're going to be trying to take all the opponent's arguments, use that as your own offense with a slight net benefit in some way. So you would argue this in some way of reform is coming now. So one example of this that I found, and there's so many examples, just a cool one was the Safe Tech Act. It is a 2023 bill example that is possible. I'm not saying this specific one's going to get passed. You can find your own uniqueness evidence on this, as I do think this is going to be the hardest part of the argument is to find a specific bill that you like, that you can prove in some way will get passed. And possibly finding your own unique bill could give you your own strategy, as people are going to have to respond to this with a unique argument that your specific bill will not pass. Otherwise, you can outweigh contextualization, and you can try to go through that way. So that's the first we can look at it, is you can find a bill that is a reform that in some way moots Section 230 and tries to get rid of parts of it, which we can see an example of this was FOSTA SESTA, which did get passed in 2018. So even though I said earlier how that possibly could be a harmful bill, you can see other ones that could be better, such as Safe Tech, that is able to beat this. And this is possible, especially now because big tech is in the spotlight. Big tech has never been more so in the spotlight, where we see CEOs of all these major companies constantly being on the stand to defend their actions. And we can see this too with the way that they're held liable for stuff on their platforms. Like I'm trying to remember like the quote. I remember it made me laugh a lot. I think it was like somebody asked like Mark Zuckerberg what he's going to do about Finstas, and it's like, oh wow, Congress is like totally doesn't know what any stuff going on social media is, but at least like it's in the spotlight. They're trying their best, like they're trying right now to call out what is going on in big tech. And the repeal makes reform impossible. It's like where if we completely remove Section 230, then that makes it where it removes all the progress made on the idea of free speech. And so you can have some sort of free speech impact. You can have some sort of idea how we still need to have these abilities to speak freely, have innovation, to build let these platforms prosper. And which makes this a really good, especially couple with turns, because you can have a lot of turns in specific parts of the opponent's case that you can kind of just moot out of. But so the repeal making the reform impossible means that taking the straight leap will make it never happen, because Congress likes to do things gradually. They don't like to do big things. Whenever we see big things, it's cool, but it doesn't always work in the same way that we want it to. Additionally, I want to talk about this a lot because I see this even with every topic that we end up having. Because like, I mean, I'll use a quick example on of the idea that you can't fiat a reform. A lot of people on the student debt topic, on the con, try to argue that we can have like a partial student debt waiver or get a targeted student debt waiver in some way where we could see, I think a different bill. No. Actually, I'll look at that question later, sorry. So they talk about different ways which could kind of like make different reforms, but it's important that you have to win uniqueness that the reform will happen. You're not allowed to fiat a reform, one that's just called a counterplan, which in the PF rules is not allowed. But beyond that, you're able to functionally use counterplans by using uniqueness that proves the plan will happen in the status quo. So you can use uniqueness to create functionally a counterplan by you're giving some alternative that will solve for the pro and with net benefits. However, you just can't fiat it, you have to do it, you have to prove it's already going to happen, which then does mean there's arguments like time frame that come in, like because fiat technically should be immediate and permanent, like in the normal way that we would see it. However, you could even possibly try to argue, yeah, we're saying counterplans aren't allowed in PF, but uniqueness allows you to functionally use counterplans without it being a counterplan. So counterplans are not allowed in PF, but using a good uniqueness argument makes the argument happen anyway. It is a natural result of the status quo. So you could use reform as an argument that reform is better than repealing, and we prove that reform will happen. And so your final focus is basically going to look like, hey, we are the pro here. We are the pro, but we have a net benefit. We're able to get rid of these bad parts. So the pro in some way, like, I mean, if assuming like if we quickly assume that the FOSTA test act I talked about earlier actually works to help stop trafficking on these sites, then you could argue that it's an example of something that is going to happen that will solve every bit of like the pro-trafficking argument that then also gets the benefit of the con arguments. So but you're trying to get a best of both worlds scenario here, which is super strategic. And especially if somebody's not prepared for things like reform income, and if you're winning a specific bill, then you could use that to win a lot of debates just by using the opponent's offense against them. So you get to couple that with turns. I think that coupling reform arguments with turns is going to be so strategic because one, that means that you get to highlight turns as their own contentions if you highlight them enough, but also because they all become net benefits to this contention. So even if the reform contention doesn't have a lot of like terminal impacts to it, the turns can become the ways of you garnering a terminal impact to it inside of the rebuttal, which causes a massive strategy shift and functionally lets you have a rebuttal restart, which is also unbelievably powerful. So that's what I'll say on reform for now, but I'd love to talk more about it later if anybody's curious, because I know it's like a really weird way to talk about it in debate.
Okay, so here's some general arguments to build off. We don't go as in depth as we did like with all the other arguments, but these are some ideas that you can like kind of take and run. So the first one was just extremism. So there's political extremism in the status quo. Moderates don't get elected and their views are squashed, meaning that we're having like more polarized like in politics, and people are voting for the best or the worst, not just like what goes with their ideals, but just who is like less bad. And this is because campaigns are fueled by social media and people like flame each other, and that gets like them more views and like more interactions, right? That kind of like goes along with like the whole like hate speech argument. But when you reverse 230, it leads to more restrictions and less political campaigns flaming the other side because there's like crackdowns on the content that's being posted on these third-party platforms. And then obviously we're going to see impacts of less political violence and more representation with like within, because we're going to have like more third-party candidates and moderate candidates, and less political violence is good because then we're not like seeing like how like during like the 2020 election, like the United States was like in flames, like literally and figuratively. Like we're not going to be seeing all that like political violence and like these like domestic terrorism with like attacks like on like the Capitol and like also like congressional candidates and stuff like that. And then, okay, the second one is live streamed criminal acts. So live streamed acts like are in the status quo because as Joshua was talking about with like the thing about Reddit earlier, like they slip through the cracks because they're not being moderated because there's no incentivization for those parties to do it, right? So what happened is Section 230 reverses this because companies don't want to get sued, and then we're not going to see like these live stream criminal acts, which are like really, really bad. So it's pretty much like building off the argument that he was talking about earlier with like trafficking, pretty much like the same ideas.
So, oh, you're done with live stream criminal acts?
Oh yeah, I mean, I can go more in
Okay.
depth. I just want to like get through this because I know.
You're good.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll talk next about industry consolidation real quick. This is the other side of the centralization argument that I was decentralization argument I was talking about earlier. And in these, you could talk about how centralized media can be really bad because of the ways that it causes control of individual industries. We see antitrust laws just don't work anymore. Nobody cares about them. And this means that we need decentralized media in some way to be an outcome, which will be an outcome because all the moderation would mean that people enforce their own enforce more strict rules, which cause people to go to their own media sites, which we say could be really good as the current control of consolidated media causes more broad political opinions and it becomes more widespread. So you could make that as an outcome, or you could even look at the ways in which consolidated media allows the individual media companies to have a bigger control over the audience, even if you could argue that the audience is broader, such as we see with Twitter and how it's trying to monetize in different ways by monetizing the ability to be the person seen by people. So that is an outcome of consolidation. If Twitter didn't have as big of a market share as it did, it would never be able to have such power to do the actions it has done. Additionally, the selective application argument is really good. Section 230 is kind of goofy. It allows people to voluntarily remove and leave content. It's something where you are allowed to moderate in some situations, and there's not a specific rubric in which the way that you do moderate. So you can take down content whenever you want, but also you can leave content whenever you want. This means that moderation is allowed to be very selective in how we apply to people, which means that even if a site wants free information on one way, but doesn't want free information another way, it allows people to just selectively choose that instead of having to be completely free or be completely controlled. This is because it allows you to remove content when you don't want it, and it allows you to keep content when you don't want to. So you can turn a blind eye, you can look whenever you want, and realistically, they're looking the entire time. but they're allowed to pick what is left after they see it. This can cause pushing of specific ideologies, which can cause arguments like hate speech or different ideological, like any electionist argument could potentially even work here. You probably could make some argument about how like Facebook or Twitter pushes the election a certain way. This is probably the broadest argument you could have, and you could use any input with it. Just something where selective application could somehow cause a certain ideology to be pushed, which is a pretty cool pro argument. If you want to go to the con ones now, I got those up. And on con, there's a few that I'm going to talk about. Prior moderation is the first one. The moderation of companies becomes a lot more selective in these ways. To make the moderation better, companies have to screen possibly beforehand in order to effectively attack things like hate speech. If I it was to like if somebody's to post hate speech on a website, there's no way like you can be held liable for it after it's posted, especially once it's on the internet, it never goes away. Which is something that I think everybody's probably heard from their parents at some point. Once it's on the internet, it's not going to go away. However, once in order to stop that, you have to make sure that you get rid of it before it's on. We already see forms of like AI or like algorithmic checking beforehand. If anybody's like familiar with, like, for example, like how uploading YouTube videos work, like you can upload the video in a way where it looks at the item before it's even uploaded. And this creates a double bind that you can create in the debate. Because either you can say it doesn't solve things like hate speech, as the moderation is only retroactive, or you could say it caused a freeze on information spread, which can cause issues such as you can't spread information quick enough for things like shootings or quick need news events, which rely on knowledge being moved very quickly. However, if you can't move the knowledge around quickly because you have to be screened beforehand, that could cause overall like a very kind of like court clog, but with like messages where there's too many messages going through and there's not any, they aren't able to actually be pushed out quick enough. The other argument I thought was really interesting that we could talk about is a net neutrality spillover. In Section 230, specifically Section B, it talks about how the policy stances of the United States were to be towards things like free speech. However, repealing that could be a shift in the paradigm of the United States, which could mean that we get rid of things like net neutrality in the future. The text of the topic implies it repeals the the intentions of the policy too, because the topic does not specify Section 230C, it only specifies Section 230, which includes all A through D, which means that you could do it on the policy stances, which could be really interesting. The next is the new media sites. The lower barrier to entry exists on the con world, where you can create new media sites a lot easier, which means that it's in ways you could get rid of the old ones by having a better new media site. Because if creating a social media site required strict moderation the entire time, then it would be could possibly be too costly, or it would just not even be able to exist in the first place. So new media sites are less likely to come about because the starting cost requires more moderation. So beyond that, moving on to the last one of price out, because I find it pretty similar to the new media sites one, but some sites are trying to cost money in various ways. And some social media sites would definitely pull out if Section 230 goes about, because decentralization can be on either side, depending on how you look at it. It has arguments on either side, which is why it becomes an internal link debate versus being a link debate, because the link debate is going to be true likely, or going to be likely conceded that centralization will go either way. Sorry, I saw that in the chat. I'm like, oh, want to make sure that I clear that up. So the price out argument would be that some sites are trying to cost money, and that if some sites pull out, that means that the sites that are left have more ability to control the market that's left with. So in many ways, it's almost like a reverse consolidation argument, but on the con. So a lot of the arguments on this topic work on both sides, which is also just such a cool part about debate, because it means that you can look at the same argument can flow either way, as long as you're understanding how the links and internal links are flowing, making sure that you're attacking the specific argument made instead of the broad ideas. So that's where most of your topic is, like your research is going to be. You're going to be focusing on the individual, like smaller link, or like more unique nuances of the small arguments, instead of trying to prep out like a million different contentions, because there's not going to be a lot of contentions you're going against. However, there's going to be there's going to be a few contentions with a lot of different and unique links or internal links. So yeah, I think, unless you have any other slides, Ava, that's it.
I think that's it, besides like the EIF slide at the end, which we'll talk about for a little bit.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions so far? If you do, like, please feel free to unmute.
Oh yeah, okay, Pranav. The double bind on the freeze. I thought it was super interesting because if prior moderation is to happen, it means that, so the argument would be that prior moderation is a necessity. However, the cost of moderation being higher, lower. No, we're saying on the con, there's less moderation. There's less need to have moderation. So I need to like stop skipping questions. Sorry.
Just like quickly clarify, like the last two slides were not like both con. Like the first one was pro. Those are just like general arguments to build off of. And I feel like that like might be like a little confusing where we put them. We probably should have put like a slide saying like other arguments, but we didn't. So, but yeah.
Okay, so I'll do the double bind first, and then I'll do the barrier of entry one. So the double bind argument is that in order to make sure there's no hate speech on platforms, you functionally have to do moderation before the item is posted. So it has to be screened before it is actually published on the internet. Because otherwise, once it's there, removing it becomes significantly harder because it already exists, it already can circulate. Is the idea that in order to not be held legally liable, the item would likely have to be screened at least by an algorithm before it is posted. And so that you could argue as like an impact could slow down the spread of information. And if the opponent contests that and they say that prior moderation would not happen, so there would not be the freeze of information spread, then you just get to say that they don't solve hate speech. And then you could go on that as like overturning 230 would not be able to solve hate speech, as hate speech will happen regardless, because the only way to solve it would be after it's posted instead of beforehand. So it either, yeah. Does that, I hope that was a good answer. So the next one was, how does the cost of moderation being higher lower the barrier of entry? So that one was the con argument about how moderation does cost a lot. However, moderation is more needed in the pro world because if we repeal Section 230 and companies are held liable for the stuff on their platforms, they need a lot more moderation to stop problematic rhetoric from being thrown around more. That means that moderation is more expensive in the pro world, and in the con world, we cannot have that. We're able to have a lower cost because you need less moderation. That's why we see a lot of like really big sites with horrible moderation are able to succeed because they don't need moderation. I think one of the examples, there's like, I'm not going to say, like in the documentary I mentioned earlier, there's like this one adult video site that was able to get away with like trafficking for so long because they had almost no moderation. They had like less than 1% of the moderation that like Facebook has, even though it's like possibly roughly equal in like how much traffic it actually gets. So it's like, oh, that's a sign that you don't need moderation. You can just get away with a lot of the stuff, which is really bad. By the way, Ava, if you want to answer any questions, go for it. If not, I'll just like kind of go through them line by line.
Yeah, I was just gonna like, because these are like more questions than your arguments. I was just gonna like type stuff in the chat to like try and solve them. Because you like, they're your arguments. Those are the ones you wrote.
Go for it. Okay, so we need decentralized media, which is an outcome of this. Consolidation causes risk of broad control. Decentralized media, that was the pro argument, which is that decentralized media would be really good because it could stop consolidation. Consolidation would be a natural occurrence of companies being able to like control the market more, especially with because they don't need a lot of moderation or because people feel home on anywhere. So like even if like no matter if you're conservative, if you are liberal, leftist, whatever you are, you can find like, for example, a home on Twitter. If Twitter starts enforcing its political ideologies more though, you're less likely to feel that, which means that consolidation is a lot less likely to happen in a pro world because companies are able to force are able to push their ideologies more or have to in order to make sure that they don't get sued. So that would imply that it could, on the pro, it could decentralize media, which is good, which gets up consolidation. You could argue that consolidation is bad because consolidation is able to basically make one group able to control and push stuff. So if everybody is like using Twitter, I'm using Twitter as an example a lot, even if it's not the biggest, whatever. But so let's say like a lot of people were to use Twitter, that would mean that Twitter now has the ability to push certain things whatever it wants in the ways that it has. Like, for example, like in the way that Elon Musk pushes his own tweets, which is like just super interesting in like the way that people can abuse social media. Explain the centralization, decentralization argument. Are there currently screeners really fast? I'm looking through all of them because this doesn't run away.
Quickly, was the thing
Okay,
about
the Lucas.
the different
Yeah.
bill that Lucas said, was that about the reform arg?
Wait, would having a different?
I
Okay, so would having a different, Lucas, if you want to ask that, sorry.
So the main argument,
yeah.
this was during the slides when you were saying that if you get a different bill, then that would count as the status quo working, right?
So you'd have to prove that the bill would actually pass or is like either has or is passing in some way. So that's why you could utilize individual bills and then just like have a uniqueness article about how that bill will pass. So that's why like it's the actual reform arguments are super weird on this topic because there isn't like one specific bill that's trying to pass, but we can see a broad idea of legislation from Congress that's trying to attack big tech It just means that there's lots of individual bills that are being more popularized more and more now, which can be really useful for these arguments. You said that it became a technical action where you say you're repealing in this quo. It's kind of repealing, but remember there's different types of repeals that we mentioned earlier. So there's both express and implied, and there's also with and without savings. So the example of I think I forgot FOSTA Sensa, that one was a bill with savings and it was express. And it's an example of one that technically repeals 230, but in a way that's not the or not the pro world, because the pro has to be express and without savings. Meanwhile, ones with savings would be able to be viable in the status quo, because there's no in Congress act that's going to repeal all of Section 230. Repealing all of Section 230 is something that Congress is not looking to do. However, there are lots of minor ones that change different parts of Section 230, such as FOSTA mentioned earlier. Can you go for no solvency arguments against the pro? No, you cannot go for no solvency arguments against the pro. The reason is because the pro gets access to what's called durable fiat. Durable fiat would mean that we assume the the pro world happens insofar as we vote pro, which the con does not get access to fiat because the con is just the status quo. It's just that we should not do the pro world. But the pro gets the ability of saying, hey, this is going to happen. If all debates came down to whether or not the Supreme Court would overturn it, that's going to be really bad. And also there's no way to exactly prove if an argument, the burden to prove an argument being overturned by SCOTUS is going to be super, super hard, because the amount of cases that they take is super unpredictable. The chance of them taking it and overturning it is unpredictable. Free speech, especially, I think that overturning the free speech law probably would be a little bit weird, but also I think that also it's a toss-up in how the Supreme Court would currently view it, because it's both is free speech, but also in many ways an immunity that has clearly been abused to push to allow atrocities to happen. And we see that overall, if it came down to just 230, I think it would be more likely the Supreme Court would have so much variability in how it would view it, which makes it pretty hard for us to actually choose whether or not it would or would not pass. Switch section was deemed unconstitutional. Reno versus ACLU in the SCOTUS. How long ago was that one? If I'm correct, that one was a good 1997. So I would say that even if it proves that the Federal Communications Decency Act is unconstitutional, I think there's more recent laws that prove it is constitutional. For example, I cited two inside of the speech that I gave on, I think it was trafficking, where I talked about the Supreme Court case about Reddit versus I think it was Jane Doe's versus Reddit, which did uphold 230. So there's a more recent Supreme Court case which does uphold 230 than the Reno one. And also, I think the whole reason why Section 230 was made, funny enough, the background of Section 230 is it was made to overturn Supreme Court cases that had precedent that companies were held liable. So Section 230 in its essence is meant to be antithetical to the Supreme Court in some of these ways of constitutionality. It's kind of goofy. Let's see. Also corrects by the original author, going to it's harmful. But yeah, so I don't think the Reno versus ACLU works, because also unless you'd have to prove that Section 230, because I think the way that it would pass through is that you get eventually a Supreme Court case against it to get overchecked. I think the only way that you could actually prove that Supreme Court case and that the agreement could get overturned would be one about how it passes now, but it's overturned later. Because I think that if it gets overturned in the initial passing of the bill, that probably is covered by durable fiat. It's kind of goofy. Were there any other questions? Sorry, if you had a question that I missed, could you repost it? And yeah, sorry, Ishmael, there is not currently a block file. However, if you message me at a different date, then we might be able to do that. Ava, do you see any other questions?
I don't see any. Okay, so I guess with that, thank you guys for everyone for coming. And just a couple of things before we leave, just about EIF in general. Make sure you join the Discord, because we have such an active community and there are so many resources that people just have right under their noses. Look at our website, and you should check out our Instagram. And we have a bunch of different local chapters, so you can see if you have a local chapter, and if you do, try and get people to join, and just in general plug EIF to your friends so that we can help more people across the globe. But yeah, thank you for coming. Do you have anything you want to say, Joshua?
No, have a fantastic day, everybody.
Okay, bye. Oh wait, there's two questions.
There were?
Never mind, there's none.